All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's session, Ask the Experts About COVID-19 and Neuromuscular Disorders. Today's session is available in English and in French. The session will be recorded and available for later viewing on MDC's YouTube page. The responses from today's session will also be included in a plain language webinar report posted to our website. My name is Reshma Amin, and I'm the Director of Knowledge Translation and External Engagement at Muscular Dystrophy Canada. On behalf of the Neuromuscular Disease Network for Canada and MDC, welcome to this session. I'll pass it over to my colleague, Marie-Hélène Bolduc. She'll explain that the session is available in English and French and how you can be sure that you're in the right section. Go ahead, Marie.
Bonjour, alors bienvenue à ce webinaire sur la COVID-19 et les maladies neuromusculaires demandées aux experts. Je voudrais vous dire que les questions aujourd'hui sont répondues dans un langage simple, que le webinaire serait enregistré et sera disponible sur YouTube très bientôt. Et aussi, un rapport sera rédigé et apparaîtra sur notre site Internet et sur le site Internet du network NMD. Alors, pour choisir la langue française, vous allez dans l'icône en forme de cercle, de sphère, et vous allez choisir français. Alors, à chaque fois que quelqu'un parlera en anglais, vous allez l'entendre en français. Et si des gens interviennent en français, vous allez aussi les entendre en français. Alors, merci et bon webinaire.
Thank you very much, Marie-Hélène. All right. To date, Muscular Dystrophy Canada and NMD4C has received over 100 inquiries about the COVID-19 vaccine. So we thought we would put together this session so you can hear from the experts themselves, the responses. And as I mentioned, there were additional questions that will not be covered in today's session, but will be available as part of that webinar report. It is a busy time, so we're extremely grateful to our expert panel for being here today to talk to us about COVID-19 vaccines. First, we have Dr. Hans Lochmuller. Dr. Lochmuller is a pediatric neurologist, a neuromuscular specialist, and a researcher. He's also the lead at the Neuromuscular Disease Network for Canada. Dr. Lochmuller has been instrumental in helping us to lead the Ask the Expert series for both the one that we launched back in April and with this edition as well. Next, we have Dr. Hans Katzberg. Dr. Katzberg is an adult neuromuscular specialist and a neuromuscular disease researcher at the University Health Network. Dr. Reshma Amin, she's a respirologist, sleep physician, and an NMD researcher at SickKids, also a member of the Neuromuscular Disease Network for Canada. We've got Dr. Pham-Huy, and she is here today. She is an infectious disease specialist at CHIO and the chair of Immunize Canada. Dr. Allison McGeer, senior clinician scientist, infectious disease specialist, and COVID-19 researcher at Sinai Health. Dr. Megan Bettle, director of the COVID-19 regulatory response team at Health Canada, the Government of Canada. Stacey Lintern, CEO of Muscular Dystrophy Canada. Thank you all in advance for being here today. So we'll go ahead and pass it over to Dr. Pham-Huy, who will be addressing some of the most popular questions. So we'll start with the first one. What is the difference between the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines?
Excellent. Thanks again for the invitation. So I'll just ramble on. We'll talk a little bit actually about the similarities, because there's probably more similarities than differences at this point. So both of these vaccines are using the relatively novel platform of messenger RNA vaccines, which I think Dr. McGeer is going to go through more details of that. Both of these vaccines manufacturers use essentially a recipe for the a surface protein of the coronavirus called the spike protein. So it instructs our cells on how to make this protein, which then presents to the surface and then elicits the immune response. Both of these vaccines were studied in very large clinical trials. So for the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, it had over 44,000 participants, and Moderna had over 30,000 participants. So in the world of vaccine clinical trials, these are very huge trials. Both of them studied a fairly broad age range in the adult population. So the Pfizer-BioNTech studied participants 16 years and older up to about 85, and then The Moderna also studied an adult population, 18 plus, up to I think around 95 years, which good, relatively pretty good representation in the older adult population as well. Both vaccines did show very good efficacy in the prevention of symptomatic COVID-19 disease. So people, again, with symptoms from the infection, showing around 94 to 95% if the participant received 2 doses of the vaccine. So this efficacy data, or this interim data, is following response or prevention data after receiving 2 doses of the vaccine. And so they both are, mRNA is a very, delicate material, if you want. So it does require some specific storage requirements to maintain its integrity. So Pfizer is a little bit more tricky. As you may have heard, it does require some refrigeration of down to like -80. Moderna has a slightly easier refrigerant requirements, and you can actually have it in like normal medical refrigeration for a longer time. So a little bit easier to store and dispense. Both vaccines do not contain any adjuvants or preservatives or gelatin or egg or antibiotics. They are essentially, the mRNA is wrapped in a lipid bubble. So it contains some lipids, it contains a bit of sugar and salt. Both actually contain a component called PEG, which has been thought to maybe be a potential allergen. So that's essentially the I guess more similarities than differences between the 2 vaccines. But I would say both vaccines are highly efficacious. Both vaccines have not had any significant safety signals either in the clinical trials.
Thank you. The next question is around how long is the vaccine good for? Would I need to repeat it in a year or in a few months?
So this is a good question, and no manufacturer can claim that they have 5-year data on their vaccines. So right now, in terms of those specific vaccines, in the initial reports that have been provided, I think they followed the participants up to about 4 months. These are clinical trials that are ongoing, so they'll be following the participants for 2 years. And so the thought is that we know that we have short-term data that is excellent. Do we have information on 6 months, 12 months? That is yet to be determined. But if we analyze how it elicits an antibody or an immune response, it looks pretty good. So I would guess that it at least lasts, a few months. We'll have to see the data from the clinical trials to what the response is or the prevention is after a year or so. So stay tuned.
Okay, this was probably the most popular question. Why is the vaccine not for children? Why is one vaccine indicated for 16-year-olds and up and the other for 18-year-olds?
Yes, I get asked that question a lot, and I think there's this fear that they're going to forget the kids, or it's not good for children. So the simple answer is that it was not, the initial clinical trials were not done in children. So we don't have pediatric data. The reason that the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine has been now authorized for 16 years is that they actually were able to expand their clinical trials this fall and include 16 and 17-year-olds. So we have safety and efficacy data in that age group. And so right now it's not authorized for the children because of the lack of data, but both manufacturers are currently enrolling children into their clinical trials. So we hope to see that data, and we hope that it is also safe and efficacious in that age group. So they'll be starting with the 12 to 15 or 17 years old, and then we'll see. So another stay tuned question.
No, I appreciate it. The next question is, with new talk of variants, and I believe Dr. McGeer will be expanding on this. From your knowledge, does the vaccine work on these variants?
So there are many different variants, and there are many different variants of concern that are currently being reported. Right now, I don't think it's a black and white yes or no. I think there are nuances to it, and there are some reports that suggest that Some of these vaccines may still work, but maybe not as well. But again, it'll be important to know, like, if that difference becomes it is clinically significant, or it makes an impact on what we are seeing in how people are infected, or how they you know, if they get sick. So at this point, I think that we are still learning. There are some reports that suggest that it might work, but not as well. And it also will depend on the actual variant. So we're talking about these days the variant of concern from the UK or from South Africa or Brazil. So they are all a little bit different. And so they may have a different impact on these vaccines.
Very good. Well, we've been recently hearing a lot more about vaccine hesitancy. Some of the members of the neuromuscular disease community are really eager to receive the vaccine and would like to be prioritized for it. So a common question has also been, how can I advocate for receiving the vaccine earlier? Particularly a family message and said, I have a medically complex child at home. Can Immunize Canada help?
Yes, another excellent question. So as people know, in Canada, health is under different jurisdictions, under different provincial and territorial jurisdictions. And as much as Health Canada will regulate the use of these vaccines, there are the Public Health Agency of Canada with the National Advisory Committee on Immunization in Canada that makes recommendation on how to use these vaccines. And so we knew that there was going to be the vaccine supply was going to be small at the beginning, and the supply issues. And so NACI, or the National Advisory Committee on Immunization, did put out guidance on prioritization of key population, trying to aim for patients that are at the highest risk of severe disease, complications, or death from COVID-19, as well as high risk of transmitting to patients or individuals who are at increased risk. So at least I actually, it's a good idea. It's become a bit complicated to put into practice, but in principle, we were aiming to prioritize patients who are living in congregate living settings, long-term care or chronic care facilities for seniors, adults over age 70, Indigenous communities, and also patient-facing healthcare workers. And so a lot of people have been asking me, like, where does my child or myself with an underlying chronic medical condition, where am I on this list? And it's very tricky. I think we're still trying to work out stage one, because from a national perspective, they may make recommendation, but at the end of the day, it'll be the province and territories that make the final call on how these immunization programs, or how's the vaccine going to be rolled out. So I do think that advocating to your local but provincial or territorial jurisdiction is helpful. I think there are so many different variables and things to consider. Definitely from Immunize Canada, one of our roles is to educate, but also to advocate. And so there are definitely some patient populations that maybe at higher risk of complications, and just to make sure that their voice is heard as well. So I don't know if that answers your question, but definitely I think it would be helpful to talk to your primary care provider, to your specialist, to your association, to advocate for coverage. But we'll see. We just need the vaccines in Canada.
Perfect. Let's go on to the next set of questions. So Dr. McGeer, these are for you. How do mRNA-based vaccines work, and how do they work well? What if I only get one dose of the vaccine? If I receive the vaccine, can I still carry the virus? And what is new and different about the strains of COVID-19? I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. I understand you do have some supplementary slides.
I unmute myself, you can hear me too. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. So I will try to run through. We'll see if I can get the answers to the questions built into this. Okay, so we have 3 kinds of vaccines that are either in Canada or coming to Canada. Top ones are mRNA. The newer ones that are coming are what are called viral vector vaccines or protein. When the protein with adjuvant is the old regular kind of vaccine that we usually have for inactivated vaccines. So what happens in that circumstance is you purify the protein, a protein from the virus. In this case, as Dr. Pham-Huy said, the spike protein, all of these vaccines are based on spike protein. So you purify the spike protein, you add to it a compound that enhances your local immune response to that spike protein, and then you inject it into the muscle of your upper arm. When that protein's injected, your immune system recognizes as foreign, says, we need to deal with this, and you make antibodies to it, and you activate your T-cell immunity, and that gives your body experience with the antigen. And so when you actually meet the virus, your immune system is prepped and ready to go and kicks into action really quickly, and you don't get sick from the virus, okay? mRNA vaccines and viral vector vaccines get you to the same point in a slightly different way. So I'm sorry about the complexity of this figure, but here's the mRNA vaccine. In order to make an mRNA vaccine, you take this messenger RNA. Messenger RNA is a very unstable RNA that is used by your cells for communicating from the DNA in the nucleus of your cell to the machinery that makes proteins. So let's say you're a pancreatic cell and you want to make insulin. The DNA in your cell says, time to make insulin. It makes messenger RNA that is transported out into the cell to the machinery that makes proteins, and it encodes the insulin. So that machinery then makes insulin. So in this case, what happens is you make an mRNA that encodes the spike protein. You encapsulate it in lipids that Dr. Pham-Huy talked about. Those are to allow it to stay stable. mRNA is really unstable. That's why these vaccines have to stay frozen. It's a little bit more stable in lipids, and the lipids also allow it to get inside cells. Once that mRNA is inside the cell, it says to the cell machinery, okay, I want you to make spike protein. The cellular machinery makes spike protein, and then we're back to your body says, this protein is foreign, your immune system kicks in, you make antibody and T cells to it, and when you then meet the virus, you're ready to go, and you kill the virus before it makes you sick. Replicating viral vector vaccines do the same thing, except that they use a virus that has been modified so it can't copy itself and it can't make you sick, and it uses that as the mechanism for getting the DNA for the spike protein inside your cells. The virus then makes spike protein, okay? It would normally want to make its own proteins, but it's manipulated in such a way that it just makes spike protein. And here you are, you end up back with the virus that you've injected makes spike protein, your body recognizes it as foreign, and you are then ready for the vaccine. Both these viruses that make spike protein and the mRNA are unstable. So when you get the injection, you get a burst of protein, just like as if you injected the protein, and a response to it, and then they die, and it's over. How well do they work? Well, the mRNA vaccines this was a surprise to everybody, actually. All of us were really worried that the mRNA vaccines would not work very well, because mRNA vaccines for other things have not worked well, but they're brilliant, okay? So they work 94 or 95% of the time. I'm sorry, ignore this column on the slide. This is because mostly I talk about older adults, okay? And in these trials, more than a quarter of people were older adults, and the vaccine worked just as well on them. So that's nice if you're an older adult, okay? So really good efficacy. And the vaccines that are coming behind them, the viral vector vaccine and the protein, also work really well, okay? They're a little bit more complicated, but you can see we're talking 90%, 72%, 96%, and importantly, as vaccines often do, they seem to work better against more severe illness than against mild illness. That's, of course, what we want in a vaccine to protect people, but it does raise this issue. So on the list of things that you have to wait for that we don't know yet, is whether if you're exposed to COVID and you've been vaccinated, you can get a very mild case and have the virus and be infectious to other people, even though you're not sick yourself. And so we're still watching and waiting to find out whether people who've had the vaccine are protected from serious illness themselves, but may not be completely protected from getting a really mild or asymptomatic illness and transmitting it to other people. And that's one of the reasons why you're hearing from all the public health officials that even if you've been vaccinated, you need to keep your distance, wear your mask, keep up all the public health measures you've been adhering to until we know that answer and we know that you don't pose a risk to other people. Now, this is another complicated slide, but it comes to the question of 1 dose versus 2 doses. Remember when we made these mRNA vaccines, we didn't think they were going to work well, and we were sure you were going to need 2 doses. So it's been an amazingly pleasant surprise to find out how well they work. And what's even cooler is the first dose works. So this is a graph about the Pfizer slide, but the Moderna vaccine looks exactly the same. And what you see here in the blue is the number of people who got COVID in the placebo arm over time from the first dose. And it's a straight line. So that's a steady rate of infection in the people who got the placebo, not the vaccine. In the people who got the vaccine, what you can see is it goes up to about day 12. And here's the inset that shows you more details. So up to about day 10, there's no difference in those 2 lines. And that's what you would expect, because it takes time for your immune system to kick in after you get the vaccine. And then at day 10, people in the vaccine arm stop getting COVID. Okay, so what this tells you is that at 10 days to 2 weeks after you get your first dose in a healthy adult, you are very well protected. And that's what's generated all this discussion about people can wait for their second dose. Now, you still want your second dose, okay? Because your second dose clearly gives you a boost in immunity. It will almost certainly protect you for longer, and longer protection is good. And it may well protect you better against the new variant strains. So you do want your second dose. But in the setting we're in now, where there's very few doses in the country, since we know that in the short term, people are well protected after their first dose, every country in the world is we're giving people the first dose of vaccine, and then we're waiting until we have more vaccine, because it's better to have more people getting the first dose than a half as many people getting 2 doses. So 1 dose is good as long as you're a healthy adult in the short term, but you want 2 doses eventually with all of these vaccines. Okay. Now the question is, what about variants, okay? And this is a 3-dimensional picture of what the spike protein looks like. Normally the bottom of this is embedded in the viral membrane and the top part is on the surface, and that's the part that the cells of your immune system see. And up at the top here, you can see there's something called K484 and something called N501, and those represent changes in the amino acids. Proteins are made up of long chains of amino acids, and the shape of the protein is driven by the exact structure of each amino acid. Causes the protein to fold over, or different pieces bind together. So when you change an amino acid in a protein, you change the shape. And the yellow kind of tangled mess up near the top is the part called the receptor binding domain, which is where the spike protein binds to the cells in your respiratory tract. So these mutations that are close to that change the shape. They alter how well the virus binds to the cells of your respiratory tract, and consequently how likely you are to get sick. So, and viruses do this. The other virus that does this that we recognize, of course, is influenza. It's a very parallel situation. Influenza has this molecule on the surface. It's called hemagglutinin instead of spike, but its role is the same. And it's mutations in the top of it that are the reason why you have to get new vaccines every year against influenza, and why the influenza vaccine sometimes does not work as well. So it is looking like COVID is going to be like influenza, where there is going to be this ongoing change in the virus, and we're going to have to keep working on vaccines and updating them to make sure that the vaccines cover the virus well. Now, the good news is, if you look at the current vaccine efficacy against the variants we have now, it's still pretty good. Okay, so far, the vaccines that we're going to be getting in the short term look like they work pretty well against the variants, but variants are going to continue to come, and we're going to have to watch. If we're really lucky, the virus may not be able to change often enough to escape from vaccines, and we won't need repeated vaccines. If we're relatively unlucky, we're going to have to change the vaccine every year. But you know, the good news in the slightly longer term is if that happens, what you'll probably do is get a COVID and flu vaccine every year. So we'll add COVID to the flu vaccine and still just be one shot, okay? But you will have to get it every year. So I think that's probably the end of my questions, and I will stop sharing and we can move on.
That was excellent. Thank you so much. All right, next we have Dr. Bettle. Dr. Bettle, the questions that came around, and I'm sure you've heard a lot, is how come the vaccines were approved so quickly? Do we need more time to know if it's safe?
Okay, thanks. I'll give it a try. I'll warn you, my internet connection has been terrible this week, so if I disappear, I'll apologize, but I'll do my best. So I think the first thing to understand is people are talking about the mRNA vaccines as new technology because we haven't had these types of vaccines before, but they've actually been in development, this type of technology for years and years, and they've been tested in a number of different contexts. So there's been a lot of research that went into getting us to the stage where we were ready to really quickly develop these types of vaccines. So the first thing is you know, normally in drug development and vaccine development, it can take a lot of time because money is limited to do the basic research, to run the clinical trials. And in this pandemic context, governments and research institutes really threw a lot of money at the problem. So that was a first start for really accelerating the development of the vaccines. So the entire research process has had a lot of attention, a lot of really quick work to identify the initial vaccine candidates and to put them into study. But the basic development plan, all of the basic research, the animal studies and very small human studies before broadening up into big studies, all of that work was still done for the COVID vaccines. So we kind of took advantage of, researchers took advantage of kind of adaptive clinical trial designs, ways of conducting clinical trials in a way that you could start to expand them, make them bigger more quickly, but still with really good safety controls, lots of assessment at each stage as to the safety of the vaccine before going on to a larger and larger trial. So all of the research processes have been done really quickly, but because of that really concerted scientific effort to make that development go quickly. Normally what happens with products that come to Canada, so Health Canada is the regulator. So we normally once all of the research is done, the manufacturing is done, everything's ready, then a drug company will come to us with all of their data and make a submission and ask us to review it. And we review it and we'll make a decision on, is it safe and does it work? In this pandemic context, we also took a look at our own processes and we said we couldn't wait until all of the research was done because that would take a long time. So we set up some processes which meant that companies could start giving us their data as it became available. So rather than waiting for everything to be done, as soon as they had the animal studies done, they could provide it to Health Canada. As soon as they had the first clinical trials done, they could provide it to Health Canada. So what that means is we could engage really early and we could start reviewing the data really early so that it wouldn't take us a long time to go through that process. So when it comes to the expediting review, it really means that we've thrown a lot of people at the review of these vaccines. We've been working kind of day and night since the fall as the submissions have started to come in, and that's what's allowed us to do these first reviews really quickly.
Very good.
So I think Dr. McGeer, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think we're going to say the same thing, that Dr. McGeer did answer the question around the 2 doses, but perhaps you can tell us what is the current state of vaccines and the vaccine rollout plan, and when do you think we'll see it in our community?
Yeah, so we have the two mRNA vaccines approved. So Pfizer was authorized at the beginning of December and Moderna just before Christmas. We have another couple of vaccines under review. So we have AstraZeneca and Janssen. Those are the viral vector vaccines. And we've just received the first little bit of data from Novavax, which is that protein-based vaccine, which was already mentioned. So I think we're all aware that the supply of the vaccines is kind of a rate limiting step right now. And that's completely understandable. It's the companies are trying to ramp up their production to be able to vaccinate the entire world. And this is complicated. So it takes some time to get new manufacturing sites established. And so that's why the supply has started small and will continue to grow from there. So we have the two vaccines coming in now, and those are being deployed across the provinces. The Moderna vaccine has mostly been prioritized to go up to the north because it's easier to roll out, and the Pfizer vaccine is being implemented all across the country. And once we get through the authorizations of additional vaccines, then those will also be incorporated into the rollout plans. So the timing of this is very dependent on those supplies as they come in. It's also very dependent on the ability for each province to roll out the immunization plans. But I think we'll see supplies beginning to ramp up very shortly, and that'll provide more supply for everyone, I hope.
Thank you. The next question here is around prioritization. We've talked about it already in the session. How is prioritization for the vaccine determined? Can you expand on that as well?
Yeah, so for the authorization is basically to identify who in general can get the vaccine from a perspective of the populations that the vaccine was studied in. The prioritization really comes through kind of the implementation of the vaccination plans. So as was already mentioned, the National Advisory Committee on Immunization is an expert advisory committee that looks at the clinical data and makes recommendations to the Public Health Agency to provide guidance on prioritization of specific populations. And that guidance will evolve over time as additional vaccines get authorized or as we learn more about how these vaccines can and should be used. So that's the national level guidance. And as was already mentioned, the first kind of tranche for prioritization are the frontline healthcare workers and people living in long-term care facilities. And then as supply goes up, that prioritization will broaden to other groups. And again, each province takes that guidance and figures out what's best for their context and how they should implement their immunization plans.
Great. The last question here is neuromuscular disorders, as you know, are rare and ultra rare, and time is of the essence. Could such an expedited review that you spoke about with the vaccine be applied for drugs for neuromuscular conditions?
Yes, so Health Canada already has some expedited review processes for serious and life-threatening disorders. So we have something called the priority review policy and our notice of compliance with conditions policy, which go from, so our normal review time is about 10 months. Those expedited pathways cut that timeline in half. I think, the current situation is quite unique, and we have dedicated some teams specifically to the COVID vaccines. It would be very difficult to keep up this pace, but I think we've learned a lot about how we can be really flexible with our regulatory processes and how we do the review work. So I think kind of post-COVID, there are things that we can apply to the review of other drugs as well. So this question also talked about the health technology assessment, and we do have a way of aligning our review with the HTA assessments, which are done by CADTH and NS. So Health Canada will look at the data to see, does a drug work? Is it safe? And the health technology assessment agencies will look at the same clinical data, but also that cost effectiveness piece, which has been a sticking point, I know, for this community. We have set up a process where we can start the drug submission review at the same time as the HTA review, and we can share information. So we can share our review reports and lots of information about the Health Canada assessment with CADTH and NS, and that has actually been shown to really compress those decision-making steps. So we have established that already, and it's really starting to show that we can be more efficient in making those decisions. So certainly, you know, what we've done so far is a good start, and then we can also learn from what we've done through COVID.
Very good. All right, we're moving on to the next set of questions. Dr. Lochmuller, to your knowledge, were any individuals included in the clinical trials for vaccines that have been mentioned today?
Well, thanks so much for putting this all together. It's been already fantastic, and I've learned a lot from the colleagues. I'll try to be answering these questions quite quickly. So neuromuscular disorders included in clinical trials, not to our knowledge, because most of these clinical trials include healthy volunteers. So that's determined by the protocol. So there was certainly no specific trial or subset of a clinical trial that targeted patients with neuromuscular disease.
Very good. The next question is whether the vaccine is incompatible with any gene therapies, any RNA therapies?
That's a very clever question, actually. So we heard that at least one type of vaccines is based on viral vectors, adenoviruses, and that sounds pretty similar to some of the vectors that we now use for gene therapy in neuromuscular disease, so-called AAVs, or adeno-associated virus. However, while they're named similarly, they are actually two very different viruses, and they don't share similarity. So therefore, I think there is no reason to believe that if you get the vaccine that you're immunized against the gene therapy. So that should be compatible. And similarly, there is no reason to believe that the RNA therapies, antisense oligonucleotides, would suffer or not be working in any way or be incompatible.
Very good. The next question is, as you know, Dr. Lochmuller, the neuromuscular disorders can impact muscle weakness, but also muscle loss. So which muscle is the vaccine injected, and can there be a choice in which muscle gets injected?
So usually the vaccine is injected into the muscle on the top of the shoulder, the deltoid muscle. And I think for many people with neuromuscular conditions, that will be just fine because that muscle is often preserved. However, there might be some situations or conditions where this muscle is completely wasted. And in that case, I guess the individual should talk to their doctor whether another muscle can be injected that's better preserved. And there's no reason why the vaccine shouldn't be working if the vaccine is injected into another muscle.
Very good. The next one is a 17-year-old has Duchenne muscular dystrophy and is on deflazacort. Should they be receiving the vaccine?
Yeah, so this is going into medication that some people with neuromuscular disease receive, particularly immunosuppressive medication, such as steroids or deflazacort in this case. So deflazacort does suppress the immune system and inflammation to some extent. However, not to the extent that the vaccine wouldn't work anymore. In fact, people with Duchenne have been vaccinated with other vaccines many times over many years, and most of these vaccines work. So the expectation is that the coronavirus vaccines do work in Duchenne, including Duchenne patients that are on deflazacort.
Great. And on that note, if you are immunosuppressant, what are would you expect that the effects of the vaccine would be reduced?
Yeah, so that's, I think, implied in my previous answer. Of course, there could be situations where people are more severely immunosuppressed and cannot mount an immune response at all. So need to be possibly isolated. People who get chemotherapy, for instance, with leukemia, and in that case, there might be a question whether a vaccine is appropriate, and that needs to be discussed with the treating physician.
Very good. Next question is, my son has SMA, spinal muscular atrophy, and my husband is a nurse. Should we all get vaccinated?
So in principle, yes. Carers and nurses and family members of patients who are vulnerable should be vaccinated. In terms of the son, we have this current limitation regarding age that was previously mentioned. So I don't see in the question whether the son is already 16 years or older. And that may be a limit at this point. But as we heard, the ongoing trials test the vaccines in younger children as well. And I guess everybody is pretty confident that some of these vaccines, if not all, will also be working in younger children.
Great. And why don't we go to the last question, as I think it will highlight the responses to the above ones. In your clinical opinion and expertise, should any particular person with an NMD be prioritized for the vaccine? Knowing here we've had interest from Lambert-Eaton, myotonic muscular dystrophy, SMA, Duchenne.
Yeah, so maybe I can just briefly mention myotonic dystrophy, because that's one of the most common genetic neuromuscular conditions in the country. And it's actually a clever question, because in myotonic dystrophy, there is an RNA issue. So in fact, the RNA for multiple genes doesn't get processed correctly. So there's a splicing defect. And therefore, does that affect how well the RNA vaccines work? Well, in my opinion, these RNA vaccines don't need to be processed or spliced. So I think that they do work as well in myotonic dystrophy, even though it has not been specifically tested. And I've seen a few questions in the chat, people asking with OPMD or CMT and other genetic neuromuscular conditions whether they should get vaccinated. And one would say, yes, in general, you should. Who should be prioritized? Well, this is a difficult question, as we heard before, but from a sort of more clinical perspective, patients with neuromuscular conditions, of course, they are very different in terms of what their current health is. Some do relatively well and are ambulant and can go to work and school, etc. And then there's others that do, for instance, have difficulties with their respiration or use a ventilator and would be in danger if they catch pneumonia generally, but particularly with COVID. And I think Dr. Amin will allude to that a bit more in her part of the session. So I think generally, yes, people with NMDs should be prioritized, but then there's shades of gray to that. So certain people who have severe neuromuscular disease with compromise of the lungs and respiration, I think they should be top priority.
Very good. Thanks so much, Dr. Lochmuller.
You're welcome.
I'll pass it over to Dr. Katzberg. Dr. Katzberg, we wanted to focus this section primarily on GBS. There was a lot that was mentioned in the media around GBS. So why don't we just start there? An individual mentioned they have GBS. Should they receive the COVID-19 vaccine? And also, would the vaccine contribute to or cause GBS?
So, Homira, I was wondering if I could share some slides, because I think a lot of this could be in.
Absolutely. I'm going to go ahead. Yep, go ahead.
Okay. Here we go. So can you see the slides there?
That's great.
Okay, and I am going to focus on the immune-mediated neuromuscular conditions. And I think this is a nice article that has just come out. It is from the American Academy of Neuromuscular Medicine, the Quality and Safety Committee. And I think it provides a nice overview and balanced approach on vaccine suggestions. It has already been alluded that all individuals with neuromuscular conditions, and this encompasses some of the people referenced in the question posed to me, for example, congenital myasthenic syndrome, myopathies have been discussed, These are patients who are not taking immunosuppressives, should be encouraged to take COVID vaccinations due to the fact that infection outweighs the risk. So I think we've dealt with that for the most part. And individuals with neuromuscular disease who are taking the immune suppressants, I think this is another group that was not studied, unfortunately, in the trials. So I think it's important to note that there's no data currently regarding the safety, so I agree with that. But again, the vaccine benefits of reducing COVID-19 likely outweigh the potential risks. So the other question that's come up in patients taking immunosuppressants, again, has been of efficacy in patients receiving immunosuppressants. And I think the point here is a good one, that even reduced efficacy of the vaccination in a vaccine that has such good efficacy as the mRNA vaccines we've seen likely will confer benefits against COVID infections. So that's related to vaccine efficacy. It's also noted that an increased risk of developing an autoimmune condition or inflammatory disorder was not observed in the trials. So these were the healthy volunteers. And unfortunately, there's no data regarding the risk of making the underlying autoimmune condition worse. However, it was noted that patients with autoimmune conditions who don't have contraindication may receive an mRNA vaccine. And this is most patients with neuromuscular disease. And here's the point about GBS, and I'll allude to that in more specifically in a minute. But again, it's commented on here that if the patient has a history of GBS, patients are eligible to receive the COVID vaccine unless there's a contraindication. And that is primarily patients who have had GBS in relation to a previous vaccination. I know there was a lot of issues regarding Dr. Fauci commenting on this. There's patients we know in the GBS CIDP community who have had this. It's quite rare, but it does occur. And Health Canada does have a caution on the flu vaccine, for example, on receiving that if someone has been confirmed to have GBS from a vaccination, usually within a 6-week period. And those patients, I think, should have a caution, but I think everyone else, as stated here, could be eligible. It's important to note that the vaccine does not carry the risk of inducing COVID infection, does not alter the DNA, and I think everyone should check with their healthcare provider as best as they can, and also ensure close monitoring. So I think these are general principles that are applied to just patients with neuromuscular disease in general. And we do have a little bit of guidance from the international patient groups that many of us are part of as well. The CIDP GBS Foundation International, this is the latest comment from their group on the Medical Advisory Board, that no instances of CIDP or MMN were seen during the trials. So again, that's the point, that no one has developed these conditions while receiving the vaccination, and recommends, and one must keep in mind, that COVID vaccine has only been used for a few weeks. So, a lot of questions came out in December and we really had very little data. Now it's only been a few weeks, and we're gathering more information. Millions of people have been vaccinated, so we're keeping a very close eye on this. So it may still be too early to offer very definitive statements, but so far it does not appear that there has been or reason to think that there will be any major issues in patients with CIDP or MMN. Now, this last point is interesting. It's suggested to avoid vaccination in the week following IVIG, as it may potentially lessen the efficacy of vaccination. Health Canada has a comment on this regarding vaccinations in regards to IVIG, but it primarily refers to live vaccines. And as you've heard, the vaccines that are being considered are not live. So I think this point is perhaps something to consider, but maybe challenging to organize in patients that are receiving frequent IVIG every 2 or 3 weeks, particularly given vaccination booking is quite challenging, or patients that are receiving continuous immunoglobulin. The issue being that potentially the efficacy of the vaccine could be lowered, but as you've heard, even if that's the case, the benefit from receiving it, I think, would still be substantial. And here's this point about vaccination on IVIG. If you're undergoing an active flare of your condition of CIDP, for example, that may be a time to avoid the vaccination as well as multiple vaccinations. And if you do feel that your symptoms are flaring up or worsening, certainly contact your doctor. The Myasthenia Gravis Foundation of America has put a similar statement. This is a little bit older, so really this is comments prior to observing, again, some of the more recent updates. But here the comments were similar, that patients with myasthenia gravis, even if taking immune medications, could still be considered for this, for the vaccination. And again, we're still collecting data on this. But again, the balance of evidence and the fact that patients with myasthenia are also at risk from worsening from infections. That's very well known with many infections, including flu and other infections. And the same thing is with the COVID infection, and triggering the immune system and worsening the underlying condition, as well as the effects from the COVID, that the benefits of the vaccination may outweigh any sort of small risk. And again, we keep an eye on all these recommendations. We work together as groups to put out as much updated information as possible. So I'd encourage people to keep an eye on these resources. I'll pause there. I know we're running a little short on time.
No, that's great. We'll turn it over to Dr. Amin. I believe you have some slides as well, so I'll go ahead and let you.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. It's the home stretch. So I'll start off with the questions. Can you see my presenter view just quickly? I'll just swap it. There we go. So the first question was, do we have data if children with neuromuscular disease were more severely affected by the virus than others? So the short answer is, based on the limited data that we do have, it doesn't appear that children with neuromuscular disease are more severely affected. So there was this paper that was just published last month, that basically it was a Spanish group that basically set up a registry for children with neuromuscular disease during the pandemic. And they identified a total of 29 children in their group that ended up getting COVID-19. And they categorized the patients as being asymptomatic, mild, moderate, severe, or critical. And of the 29 patients, as you can see here, 38% were asymptomatic, 52% had only mild infection, and 10% had moderate. So none of the children with neuromuscular disease actually had severe or critical infection. And in terms of who these kids are, so of the 29 children, the mean age was 8.4 years. I think this will be interesting. So who were these kids? So 21%, 6 kids had SMA1, 5 had SMA2, 4 had DMD, and then there was a broad category of 14 that included kids with Becker's or other types of dystrophies and neuromuscular disorders. In terms of clinical presentation and severity of these kids at a baseline, so overall, I think this represents the patients that we see. So 40% of them were on some kind of ventilatory support, either invasively or non-invasively. Almost 20% had a G-tube. So you can see this is not just a mild population. This is actually a pretty affected population. And despite that, these kids did very well. So this table shows a summary of the clinical characteristics. And just because we're short on time, I'm happy to share these slides with Homir and she can distribute them. But just to see that overall, the symptoms that these patients were facing were overall very mild. So just to give you a comparison, this was a systematic review of children overall without neuromuscular disease in terms of how the pandemic has affected them. And basically pulling the data together, this systematic review looked at 114 children. The majority had a mild presentation similar to what we saw in the neuromuscular disease cohort, and 15% were symptomatic. So the good news is it seems that COVID-19 infection, based on the albeit limited data, seems to have a similar impact if you have neuromuscular disease versus not, based on what we know so far. So the next question was, what's the update on who's at greater risk for COVID-19 by neuromuscular disease? So as you've heard already, we don't really have any data to say that one type of neuromuscular disease is at higher risk than others. And what I've sort of shown here is that there's some factors that would put individuals with neuromuscular disease at higher risk. And these were things that Dr. Lochmuller already alluded to, but taking an immune suppressant, using a ventilator, having a weak cough, having cardiac complications already, having trouble swallowing with a bulbar palsy, and also having a metabolic condition that puts you at risk of deteriorating during fever, fasting, or infections are potential risk factors. But we don't have data to say that they're definitive risk factors. So the next question that I had was, are there any respiratory side effects known for the COVID-19 vaccine? So what do we know about the side effects? So the side effects in the clinical trials really have been things that you would anticipate with any vaccination. So pain at the site of the infection, body chills, feeling tired, feeling feverish. There's also been adverse reactions that have been reported. And what I'm presenting here is data from the Health Canada website. So there are the data available on the website up until January 15th. There's been 90 adverse events reported. As you can skim through this list, none of them have been respiratory focused per se. But the thing that's notable, of course, is the severe allergic reaction, having some tingling or numbness or burning, having hives, headache, nausea. So really, respiratory side effects has not been demonstrated thus far. Next question is, I have a child that's mechanically ventilated. Should they receive the vaccine? I think this has already been nicely addressed by my colleagues earlier, that yes, absolutely. Once the vaccine is approved for children, absolutely children should be vaccinated. But what's not clear, as we've heard, is sort of what the timeline in Canada will be for children. And then lastly, if a child is mechanically ventilated at home and seeing multiple caregivers in the community, should the caregivers receive the COVID-19 vaccine? Yes, absolutely. This is a question I've been getting asked on a daily basis by my patients, because of course, for these patients, there's multiple caregivers coming in the home, and often these caregivers go into the homes of multiple different patients. So I just want to highlight that Muscular Dystrophy Canada is able to work with you to help advocate locally on a case-by-case basis, and you could reach out to Mrna, and her contact information you probably all know. And I think that's my rapid fire.
No, that was excellent. Just in the final few minutes, I know there were some questions for you, Stacey, so I'm just going to get to them. Dr. Amin started to talk about this. If you want to advocate for getting the vaccine and getting prioritized access, how can we work with MDC on that?
That's a great question. Thank you, Mrna. And I just wanted to quickly just commend Mrna for pulling this session together. And thank you to all the panelists. But I know that you have lots of competing priorities. So to take the time, we really appreciate it. This is a great question. We have really tried to take a comprehensive, holistic, person-centered approach to this question. And in doing that, we've set up different supports in place. So one is providing these education sessions like today. Our clients have told us that knowledge is power. Helping our clients navigate through some complicated systems. So we have service specialists throughout the country that you can contact in your local community who will help you navigate and access information that the questions that you have, we can help you find those answers. And then what we can do is, once you have determined your next steps, and in the event that you've decided that you want to move forward with vaccination, we can really wrap around our services and work with you, as we've heard on the call today, that depending on where you live in different provincial jurisdictions, there's different processes that we need to go through. But we can work with you in terms of putting a plan together, writing letters, meeting with key decision makers to help you achieve that goal.
Very good. The next question was around the pandemic really affecting individuals with, in terms of social isolation, mental well-being. Does MDC offer any supports?
Absolutely. This is another area where we've, early on during COVID-19, we knew that we needed to pivot our programs and services really to meet the needs of our clients with a focus on mental health. So we have implemented a number of webinars, networks, where we bring people together to have that personal connection. We also have, again, service specialists in local communities who have resources around mental health supports. So working in partnership with our clients and accessing the resources that will enable them to support their mental health.
Thank you. Just in the for time purposes, I'll go ahead and end it here. I just wanted to remind everyone that if you did have a question that you put in the Q&A section, we will address it as part of the report. So the report will have questions and a manuscript of today, a transcript rather, of the responses, and we'll address any questions in the Q&A. I also want to mention today that the information that's presented is accurate as best as February 5th at 3 p.m. Eastern. So there's more and more information that that we're learning, and so the information can change even next week as you're watching this video and reflecting on that report. But we really appreciate everyone's time today. Thank you once again to the panelists for your expertise and for joining us. Thank you all so much.